geluba naqdogliyo nugal waa ku darara melay nabadi joogta.
Welcome to ISIRKA. My name's Amina Isir, and join me as I take you on a journey to explore identity, culture, and belonging. Take a seat as I take you through time, space, and various perspectives of cultural identity. Stay tuned to see where the journey will take us today. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of ISIRKA. This week, I'm really excited to have Dr. Christina Woolner on the podcast. So we're going to be speaking about her recent book, Love Songs in Motion, Voicing Intimacy in Somaliland, which is based on her PhD research that she did in the country. We recently just had a conversation and met each other at London Somali Week. And so this episode will be a part of the London sub-series, but also this season 5 is dedicated to the music. And I really loved reading your book. And it was a pleasure to get to know you. So welcome, Christina.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. And hello to everybody listening.
So just to kind of get started, the question that you're probably really sick of, but I think it's a very fascinating answer. Mm-hmm. How did you end up in Somaliland? What were your original research questions? Mm-hmm. What was like the main question you were looking to answer?
Mm-hmm. So there's so many different ways that I could answer this. I'll just say, so the very original reason that I went to Somaliland was to teach at the University of Hargeisa in the Peace and Conflict Studies Department. I'm from Canada, and I had worked with an organization there that sponsored refugee students, and so I got to know several Somali students through that, and had kind of developed an interest in the region based on those relationships. And I was in between jobs, and I saw an advertisement for a position at the university, and I applied, and they asked me if I could come. So that was really my first initial introduction to Hargeisa. That was in 2013. In 2013, in the fall, I moved to the UK to start postgraduate study in social anthropology. And my original plan was to go back to Hargeisa and to do research on the peace building process. My background prior to anthropology was in peace studies. And then I went back, and in the spring of 2014, and I had a really memorable encounter that led me to kind of completely changing my research project. So I was living in the guest house at the University of Hargeisa, and there were several other lecturers there. So there were some other kind of foreign lecturers, and there were also some Somali returnees, diaspora Somalis who were living there. And some of them really wanted to watch Premier League football. And so they bought a TV, and they put these like bunny ear antennas on the roof so they could watch football. And so that was all set up. And then I remember really vividly one day the football ended, and I was kind of channel surfing and ended up on Horn Cable TV's 24-hour music channel. And there was several music videos, and I remember one where there was this man in military fatigues kind of walking through the kind of outskirts of Hargeisa, and he was like singing with very kind of animatedly, and then it kept cutting to these shots of this woman with her hijab kind of blowing romantically in the wind. And then I asked my one of the other lecturers, a Somali lecturer, I asked him, I said, what's she singing about? And he said, she's singing about love, of course. We don't sing about war anymore. And this encounter struck me on several different levels. So not only because of the kind of juxtaposition of this man's attire and what he was singing about, but also because I hadn't really heard that much music on the streets of Hargeisa. I'd done a little bit of research previously about poetry, but I'd not really encountered music. And then when I asked people to kind of tell me about their favorite songs, they would speak really passionately and at length about their favorite singers. And they would also speak in a kind of more open and intimate way than in other types of encounters. So I went back to the UK and I completely rewrote my PhD proposal. This time with love songs at its center. And my initial research questions were really quite open-ended. So I said that I really just wanted to explore what love songs do, especially in a place where speaking about love and music are both somewhat contested. And I think at that time I used the language, I think I said I wanted to study this kind of social and political lives of love songs as an alternative way into understanding what it means to live in a kind of post-war setting and a kind of really marginalized space that's really marginalized politically. So yeah, that's how I ended up on this research topic.
So you mentioned that last time. I think that's really interesting. I think it's also a really cool way to kind of look at what's happening now. Especially you mentioned like that people were more open and willing to speak about music as opposed to other topics. So how did you first react to that or navigate that?
To speaking about music?
Like talking to others about music, like kind of navigating the juxtaposition between like how open people were in expressing their feelings in regards to Somali songs as opposed to how they operate on a day-to-day society.
Yeah, well, I think this really kind of ended up being one of the core arguments of the whole book, is that for some reason when people listen to songs and then speak about songs, they're able to kind of speak in a way that they can't speak about otherwise, partly because that's what songs themselves do. So songs themselves are kind of giving voice to feelings that you otherwise aren't really allowed to talk about, or that people don't often have the right words to talk about. And in a medium that's still somewhat contested in this setting. And when people listen to that, I think it gives them space to be able to feel things that they might not otherwise be open to feeling, and then to speak about things in ways that they don't otherwise speak about. I think one of the things that shocked me the most was that so people weren't only interested in talking about music, though people would kind of at length talk about their favorite singers and tell me about where they'd heard songs the first time. But they also, talking about love songs also opened up space for people to talk about their own love experiences in a way I think that I wasn't completely prepared for at first. Because I really wasn't used to talking to people about these topics, and also because they sometimes expected me to respond in kind and to tell them things about my personal life also. But yeah, I think this is one of the fascinating things to me about love songs, is that they seem to kind of let people open up and talk about things that they don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about in other settings.
Yeah, and so even in the book, I think it was maybe the second chapter or the chapter when you were talking to Wed Summit, and they were talking about Dere and Wedeg and how he kind of serves as a love doctor where people come to him with their problems. And so kind of building off of like what we were just talking about, then like how does like, I don't even know the question that I'm really trying to ask, but I think that there was a lot of instances where or there was a lot of points in the book where like that was such a common theme that I didn't necessarily, I was really surprised by reading that, because when you see it in black and white, then it's like you have to accept it as fact, you know, like you can kind of see it happening, but reading it in that way made me really, really like think about like, are we conscientious about what we're doing, you know, as a society? Because a lot of times people talk about like within a Somali context, a lot of people talk about how these love songs are like so emotional and And whereas as a society, we don't really express emotion or love
Yeah.
in a public way,
Yeah.
like a lot of what you talked about even in this book was like everybody had these private moments with themselves with the songs, And do you like have any reflection on that?
One of the things that so the chapter that you're talking about with Wersame, what I do in that chapter is try to make sense of how songs become songs and how feelings that people kind of otherwise don't feel comfortable expressing kind of become tangible in the world as words and as voice and as music. And so one of the things that I found is that this is so love. Interesting thing to me is that love songs are often kind of heard as coming from deep, deep inside the soul. But they actually come about through this collaborative process that requires several different people to kind of think about what other people are feeling and then to put those feelings into words. And as you've alluded to here, this idea of the love doctor, this often starts with the poet and somebody who doesn't know how to express themselves, either kind of intentionally coming to the poet and saying, can you put this in words? Or a poet hearing about a really unfortunate circumstance and then taking that as inspiration to put into words. But that's only the first step. So a poet has to write words that kind of taste good, and then they give them to a lahamiste, who puts them to a melody, and then to a singer. And all of those people, they're not just doing a technical job, or this is what people told me anyway, to kind of get the feeling across. They each have to imagine or kind of inhabit the original experience of love suffering, and then from that position either make a melody or kind of convey it in their voice. So songs, even from the very beginning, kind of what they are as sounded poems given voice in a particular way, they already require people to feeling share, in a sense, for the song to kind of come about. And because of that, I think, so what they're doing, a more kind of academic term would be that they're mediating experiences in a particular way. And I think the way that they're mediating feelings is part of the key to understanding why they then allow other people to feel things and to speak about things in ways that they otherwise wouldn't be able to, because the songs themselves already kind of model, in a sense, the possibility that you can feel, you can share feelings with others, or you can feeling share. And this is where this idea of Dareen Wadag comes from. So songs in their very kind of essence are an example of Dareen Wadag, and then they allow for Dareen Wadag kind of in this ongoing chain as people listen to them and talk about them. So that's the kind of that's what I was trying to get across with that thing. And I think it links back to the first question about why is it that these songs seem to draw intimacy out of people. And that's really, I think, what drew me to them also. It's that they make space for these different types of speech and feeling.
So it's interesting how it kind of goes from a communal or a private experience of like the person going through that own personal love tragedy of sorts, then a communal experience where it's a collaboration between people to kind of bring the song to life. And it still is a public entity as a song, but then everybody has their own private ways of dealing and engaging with it.
No, and that's, I think, one of the other points that I try to make, and also part of the title, that songs, well, this kind of idea of songs being in motion, that one of the things they do is they're constantly moving back and forth between the public sphere and the private sphere in a way that other things don't normally do. So they're always kind of crossing that boundary. And I think that's one of the things that really makes them quite powerful.
And I think even in your text, you kind of go back and forth between these very kind of intimate like experiences, or like even when you're talking with Summit, like your interviews and your the relationships that you built with certain artists and things like that. And then kind of, which I guess is what social scientists are supposed to do, and then kind of take it to a larger, mainstream conversation about what is this saying about music. But I think in this text, this is the first thing that I've seen or read that really kind of went into what Somali music means to people. And then in turn, how that reflects, on its society or what it says about its society, especially in a conflict, a post-state collapse setting, that kind of aspect, 1991 onwards.
Yeah.
Isn't really the arts and culture scene hasn't really been studied as much.
Yeah.
So in terms of kind of relating your research, although you kind of gotten away from the peace studies aspect, but in terms of your other research and knowledge about post-conflict societies and peace studies, how do you what is that saying about this post-conflict society? And how is this another way of kind of talking about how people are navigating this new landscape, this very precarious landscape and still kind of very fragile?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Super interesting question. And there's so many different ways into this. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is just to say that kind of the artistic sphere was, well, like many other things, just kind of completely destroyed by the war. So artists fled like many other people, instruments were destroyed, and a lot of artists didn't come back. And for a long time, there really there were the opportunities for making music were really limited. And I think I was really lucky in that. So that encounter I described earlier when I decided to change my research project, that was the spring of 2014. And I started my longer term kind of 18-month period of fieldwork in the summer of 2015, and in between that time, Hiradawar opened, which was, I think, as you know, is the kind of first music venue to have operated in the country. It had been 25 years at that point, and I think just kind of paying attention to how that venue was able to kind of establish itself, and the spaces that it opened for people was really quite revealing of the political landscape at the time. So this is part of the story that I tell in chapter 6. So obviously they faced some backlash from certain kind of religious authorities that didn't approve of music being there. But the venue, I hope I've kind of been able to show was able to exist partly because of the kind of social and political capital that Sarah Halgan has as a kind of veteran of the SNM. So she has a certain political clout because of that, and was able to resist some of the some of the challenges that she faced, and also the fact that it was set up as a place dedicated to preserving heritage. And I know you've been there, for your listeners who haven't been there. So it's the original venue, and anyway, had all these little uckles set up around. There was a lot of kind of traditional textiles and woven things and kind of implements, kind of decorating the venue. So it was set up as, and the name, of course, also means kind of taking care of or preserving heritage. So I think because it was able to operate in part because it was set up like that. And so so looking at a space like Hiradawar, I think, is really interesting because it tells us a lot about the political climate and how people kind of negotiate space for themselves and are trying to make space for kind of more, for music, but also for certain types of relationships, and just trying to kind of make space for or kind of make the urban scape more inclusive, in a sense. So I think that's one way that I attempt to kind of do it, and I think you get the biggest sense of kind of the politics of love songs in the last chapter there. I think one of the other one other thing that was really interesting to me is when I started the research. So I knew that love songs had this kind of history of political critique, and that they had been used like during the Barre era as a way to criticize the government. So to kind of evade the censorship regime, you could put your critique in a love song rather than kind of saying it openly. And so I thought, oh, and this is the kind of thing anthropologists love, like, oh, undercover kind of critique resistance. So I thought, oh, maybe I'll find something like that. But I really didn't. And people were really quite adamant with me. Well, first of all, I think it was what a cellmate said to me one time when I asked him, I was like, do you ever hide political critique in your songs? And he's like, no, I can criticize Solano to his face. Like, there's no need to. And so the fact that songs can be heard as love songs reflects the fact that Somaliland has a really quite open speech environment, which is also quite interesting as compared to previously. But I think the other thing is that so people were really adamant to me that these songs were love songs, and they really wanted to kind of guard them as love songs, and not as something else, because I think they're, I don't quite know how to phrase this. I think the real power lies in the fact that people kind of protect them as, well, Sarah Halgan said to me once, as anti-political, that they provide a space for people to kind of forget about the political or other cleavages that might color their relationships in everyday life, and allow people to kind of exist together in a space of shared vulnerability, in a sense. And I think that the way that this is actually really quite important for how for questions of reconciliation, and the way that individuals come to terms with their own personal traumas, not necessarily related to the war, but in kind of parallel to it. So I think the one thing that I had to do to kind of make sense of the political power of love songs was to accept that they are anti-political, in some sense. And I think keeping space for that is really important in a post-war setting where there are still a lot of different types of tensions and cleavages that challenge how people relate to each other day to day. And I think the one other thing that I'll say is that, so it's now 10 years since Hirodaur opened, and a lot, I think, has actually changed in that time. So it was that the place that so Hirodaur, I think, I don't want to say emboldened, but maybe emboldened.
Yeah, I think so.
It made space for other people to then make music, and so there are now many other places where you can go and see live music performed. But I still think it was significant that the first one that was able to exist was opened by somebody with significant kind of political clout, and set up in a particular way.
I think you touched on like a lot of great points. I was like taking notes, and I was like, oh my God, like there were like 3 different times where that could have been like a whole conversation in itself. But I think I want to go back to Hirodaur for just a second. And I think I've told you this personally, but I just want to say it now. Like, what you've done with this research and this book is kind of captured what's happening now in live time. And I think there hasn't been too much work of what's happening now in a way that like contextualizes and recording like what Hargeisa is, you know? And I think that groundwork in the first chapter is very, very important to understand Hargeysa's reputation as being the home of Somali arts and culture, but then also this city that kind of went through resistance, that was like leveled down during the Siad Barre regime. And so I think even like Somalilanders everywhere really have this kind of connotation of like, you know, they have rebuilt, and Hargeisa itself as like the capital city has been rebuilt completely post 91, right? So a lot of times when I was in Hargeisa, even like the folks my dad's age, even my uncle when he first picked me up from the airport and drove me in, everybody was like, this is not the Hargeisa we remember from the 70s because the city has grown. And so I think, and even now, if you're gone for 3-4 years, you're coming back to a new city, you know? And there's this notion of like, oh, well, you know, that came after you were last year, and that came after, like, it's rapidly growing. And so I think that it's very important, like the way you kind of laid that, like, you know, contextualize that, because it's a very different place from a lot of other cities. I went to Mogadishu and you can still see like, you know, remnants from the colonial era amidst, you know, bombed buildings and stuff like that. But Hargeisa, a lot of that is gone. There aren't any physical remnants of a lot of what happened to it. It kind of lives in through the people. So I really want to like thank you and commend you for that, because history is fleeting. Like people will not remember in 10-15 years. But also in terms of Hitodor, I was also, I first went to Hargeisa in 2015. So that was, I think you wrote a little bit about...
pretty new then,
but you also wrote a little bit about Cup of Art. And when I did my master's like paper about diaspora returnees in Somaliland, and I talked to the owner of Cup of Art. That's how I started my research. My paper. And so that was a very highly contested year for me. For my first time to be there and see all these spaces of, you know, cultural and artistic expression face literal pushback and extreme pushback. So it's kind of like, I think in some ways when you said like Hitodor was emboldened others, like I think it was like Hitodor had to walk so others could run type of thing. So now there's so many different places where it's just for music, whereas Hitodor and the cultural center, they were like, we are Somali cultural thing, you know, like Hitodor had the Mohammed Moge Akal, you know, so it was like a picture of him, like so it was very much paying homage to like, we belong to this environment, this current Hargeisa post re-reclamation of like statehood. We fought for this, and Mohammed Mogo was also a singer, you know, so it kind of like, there was so much, I think, initial groundwork to be like, you know, there is music, but it's also part of our cultural celebration, you know, we need to have these spaces. And I think that so now it's kind of, now you have other places where it's like they're literally just there to enjoy music, like there doesn't have to be any excuses of like this is, you know, so that is like something big. And also even with the artists, that it isn't a matter of just Hidiga Giska or like those that are oh man, I keep wanting to speak Somali. I'm trying to say everything in English, but those that are like Hidiga Giska are government employees, like for the most part. You know? They're employed through the Minister of Culture and Information. So now that there's other artists that are also kind of existing as just like Dayah Band, for example. And other groups. So it's kind of like there doesn't have to be like this one highly curated like nucleus of like this came out of this environment.
No, I think the Cup of Art thing was really interesting for me, because that was basically at the same time. And so it really, like, it provided this really clear, like, why has this one venue been able to survive when this other one has just been, has really not been. And I think, so kind of looking at what allowed Hitodor to thrive, or to survive, and thrive, where the other one didn't, was, I think really quite telling. I think if somewhere like Cup of Art opened now, though, they would probably be okay. I think maybe they were a bit ahead of their time.
You mentioned that you went to Hargeisa a few times before you went back to start doing your fieldwork experience.
Yeah.
So how was that like? Because what was it? Was it 2014 or was it 2015?
My fieldwork. The bulk of the fieldwork was from the July 2015 to December 2016. So it was like 18-month stretch. And then I went back kind of for a couple weeks or a couple months every year after also, other than the pandemic. But yeah, the bulk of the research was 2015, 2016. So most of the book is kind of set or took place during that period. Yeah.
I was there 2015 and 2016. So I'm like, I literally remember it was very hard being there. So Christina, how was that for you?
we were probably like at Hidodower at the same time at some point. Or
were you also
in these?
Also the cultural
and the cultural center. Yeah. So I can tell you my research started at the cultural center. So that was the first kind of point of contact when I got there. Jama had gotten these cassettes and wanted to start this sound archive. So the first couple of months that I was in Hargeisa, I helped catalog the cassettes in the sound archive, which was a really fascinating entry into this. I did all of this with another volunteer who he was a couple of years younger than me, so wasn't born when all of the songs that were on these cassettes were released, but he just had a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of Somali music. So and this was a really kind of fascinating introduction to the scene, because we just spent our days like sticking labels on cassettes and then getting distracted by all the stories that came along with the names of the artists that were written on the outside. And then when we got a cassette player, listening to the cassettes, and then he would kind of tell me the stories of some of the songs. So yeah, that was a really kind of fascinating entry. And I also took Somali lessons during those months.
Oh, cool.
And then kind of continued on throughout. And then I think early in my research, I did a lot of interviews as a kind of entry to getting to know people. So I interviewed a lot of artists. I think I did probably about 60 interviews in total of kind of young artists and older artists who weren't really working anymore. So poets, musicians, and singers. And that was a good kind of entry. But I think the bulk of very little of that interview data actually finds its way into the book.
I was just going to ask you about that, because that seems like it could be its own project in itself.
Yeah, well, I've talked with some people at various times about somehow publishing the transcripts of some of these interviews, because a lot of that stuff, a lot of it was providing some really important kind of historical context for things that were going on. But a lot of that stuff doesn't feature in the book. And part of that is because and anthropology really kind of privileges ethnography and like just spending time with people in day-to-day settings. And I think interviews certainly have a space, and a lot of my research since my PhD has been a lot more interview based, just because after your doctoral research, it's really a privilege to have 18 months to just go and hang out with people. Doing these interviews was a good introduction to a lot of artists, who then several started inviting me to kind of spend time with them, or to come and talk to them again. The first one who kind of invited me to come back and come back again was Khadra Dahir, who I got to know really quite well over the course of my fieldwork, and she became a dear friend, and I'm extremely grateful for the time that I got to spend with her. And then through somebody I met at her house, I also was then introduced to Abdi Nasser Ma'alin Aidid, because I think when I was at Khadras, I had been talking about wanting to learn the oud and wanting to get an oud, and telling people, why can't I find an oud, and why can't I find a teacher? And then another singer there was like, he phoned me and he's like, I know how you can get an oud. And then after that, he's like, I will introduce you to Abdi Nasser, who recognized me because there are not that many Adan people turning up at Hirodawa every week. And he was playing there. So he knew who I was because I had watched him perform so many times. And so he took me on as a student, and I spent a lot of time in his house. So the two of them were really kind of key figures to my experience. And then, as I'm sure you've read also, the book. So those were started in the archives, interviewed a lot of artists, spent time with them. And spent a lot of time at Hirodawa also. And then the other kind of piece of my research that developed somewhat accidentally, which kind of goes back to the beginning of our conversation, was just asking people to play, like to bring their favorite songs and to tell me about their favorite songs. And at first I thought of these as kind of listening sessions. So I thought we would just listen to the songs and I would learn about the songs. Yeah. But people actually just about everybody brought me songs that had been important to them in their own love lives at some point or another. So these conversations often ended up being quite long and involved conversations about people's love histories. And I don't think I would have been able to have those conversations if the entry hadn't been love songs. So that, in terms of kind of what actually gets into the book, then those conversations become the chapter about listening is based on those kind of sessions. But yeah, so that was the field work. I'll say I have traveled and lived in other places. This wasn't kind of the first time I have been out of my comfort zone. Hargeisa is not an easy place to live. I certainly was frustrated on more than one occasion and wondered how I was ever going to complete all of these things. I don't know if I completely appreciated it in the moment, but certainly during the writing process came to realize how much love songs had actually allowed me to kind of stay there and to be able to continue doing the research. I think it was actually by living there for an extended period of time that I came to really understand how kind of people often talk about songs as being therapeutic and being in the presence of artists as allowing you to kind of relax and find relief, which I think the more I got to know the space and the more I got to know songs, the more I kind of experienced for myself how that was the case. I think Khadra's home and Abdi Nasser's home are the two spaces that I felt most at home and most like I could kind of just exist and not always be worried about what other people were thinking. The kind of content of my research is partly what allowed me to helped me to make sense of the experiences and to cope in a sense and to appreciate how reparative love songs can be and the kind of relief that people find in the presence of artists and especially singers.
And I guess a lot of that is like from that context, like from being there, then you get that. Like for me now, like I'm like, okay, I'm very, I appreciate being able to see Hargeisa, and then there'll be certain ways in which I continue to engage in the future. Like, it'll be done like very much like how I want. It was a lot like for me too back then. Yeah. But the one thing that I undeniably, well, other than Shah, like I used to drink, you know how the old men drink Shah on the side of the street? I used to have this friend that would take me to go drink Shah on the side of the street, like at night, and I was like, oh, just going against all these like gender norms but between Shah and Qaraami music, especially at night in Hargeisa, like listening to like, because the city's actually quiet for once, like and so Qaraami songs also always make me think of Hargeisa, or like, and it's just kind of and that's something that I still really like. I think it kind of is like a grounding type of effect because there also wasn't really that much to do there, like, so you really have to kind of be present in like with yourself and like the engagement, the environment that you're in. So for me, like Qaraami just feels like a very grounding type of experience where I'm like somewhere outside of the outskirts of Hargeisa, just like it's just you, nature, and God. So I really appreciate Qaraami music now because it reminds me of Hargeisa. I appreciate the memory, but I think it is something, that's why also I think that you doing this research in Hargeisa more than Hargeisa as opposed to any other Somali city is also really important because the sound is not the same in other places.
No, it's definitely a story about Hargeisa in a kind of particular moment also.
Yes.
In history.
This is also another story of like this is a story of a resistance in a lot of ways, like resistance to exist and to feel and to express despite. Like I think going to your point about how love songs were apolitical, there were a lot of times even Abdel Nasser talked about how that there always was a space for love songs despite the situation, and I think it's what that is really kind of showing is like people don't necessarily want to be defined by their situation. They still want to be humans having a human experience.
No, I remember him telling me like they're I think you're talking about the one part where he's kind of narrates his journey that involved kind of being displaced into a refugee camp, and then playing music during the struggle for the SNM, and then being a combatant himself. But he kind of said that they were, obviously there was a moment when they were playing a lot of songs that were very political, but people still fell in love. People still got married, even when they were in the refugee camps. So I think I've reflected, and somebody's also mentioned this to me before, the very initial moment where my housemaid in the guest house said, "It's about love, of course. We don't sing about war anymore." That comment suggests that there was a period where they were only singing about war, but that actually wasn't the case. There were love songs, I think, kind of still running through there in different ways.
So then there were two chapters, one about your relationship with Khadra Dahir and another one about your relationship with Abdel Nasser Al Aidid. You have like the singer, like the one who's kind of, her voice and her songs are still even, I think they'll be remembered for a long time and kind of a strong placehold in Somali society as, she said she's Ala'al, but like she one of the first ones to really kind of like pour her heart out through her songs.
And an example of one of these songs is Khadra Dahir's Hafoon, a very famous Qaraami song.
And I saw like there was a interview on Al Jazeera. I think there's a couple of random articles on Al Jazeera about Somali artists. So the one about her was saying that she became an artist so that she could express herself. How did your relationship with Khadra really impact how you understood love songs, how your research kind of went, and what did it kind of teach you about intimacy as well?
Yeah, there's so many things I could say about Khadra. I think I've already alluded to one of them, is that I felt comfortable in her home, and she really had a kind of grounding presence for me. And I've been back to Hargeisa several times since she passed away, and it really it feels different. Still to me, I certainly miss her presence there. I think I'll highlight two things. So the first is that the time I spent with her, I think, really helped me understand the figure of the artist and how people relate to singers in particular. So her home was like a really social space. People were kind of constantly coming and going. So her friends would come, politicians would come, old retired singers would come, new young singers. They would bring people along who were curious. And I think the way that people interacted and spoke in her home is really a lot different than what I witnessed in other spaces. And they were freer in a sense. And people told me that they found a kind of relief in being in her presence, and that her house was kind of like a mental health hospital of sorts. And a big part of that was, I think, was just that Khadra was an exceptionally generous and warm-hearted person. And she was known kind of for her qalbi furan, or her open heart. And yeah, so she was just a warm person. But it also had to do with the fact that she was a singer, and that she had kind of publicly dared to bear her own love suffering to the world. And I think this was something that was known not only in her songs, but also people knew about her kind of love history and her relationship with Ahmed Ali Egal. And those were kind of topics that people didn't really talk about there, and she didn't actually like talking about them. But the fact that I think everybody knew something of her story, and that her songs kind of existed, they already, that she had already kind of born her suffering to the world, made her a kind of safe space where people could let down their guard. And I think somebody once used the term to me. They said that artists have a kind of flexible culture, and they exist in this kind of liminal space. So they're allowed to, people allow or expect them to kind of be different, and be freer. And they're allowed to kind of behave and speak in a way that that other people can't. And I think that being in a space like that, I think, just allows people to kind of to let their guard down. And I think that's also what songs do. So Khadra was in many ways an embodiment of this. And yeah, I think you mentioned before that she herself once told me that she was Allah. So yeah, I think the first thing is that I think she showed me kind of what the figure of the singer is for people, and how they relate to singers. I think so. The second thing I'll mention is one really memorable encounter that is in the conclusion of the book that helped me to kind of understand love suffering differently. And this was, like, I think, near the end of my longer period of field work. We were sitting in her home one day. I think we had like a book of songs somebody had compiled, and she was kind of telling me about them and correcting some of the lyrics and stuff like that. And talking about Ala'al. And I think I just turned her and I said, "What does Ala'al feel like?" And she looked at me really confused. And she was like, "Christina, haven't you been in love? What are you talking about?" And we'd had conversations about my love life. She knew my husband, who often also came to her house. And I said, "Well, yeah, but okay, I've been in love, but I'm not really sure. I don't know. No, I'm not sure I know what you mean." And I kind of said, "Okay, if he's away, I sometimes miss him, whatever. Maybe my stomach hurts a little bit. I get these little feelings sometimes." And she said to me, "Okay, it's like that, but times 1,000. And then very, very genuinely said, "Christina, I hope that you know this suffering. I want you to know this suffering too." And I was really kind of perplexed and unsettled by this. Like, why would she want me to suffer? And she did very genuinely kind of say, I want you to experience this. And I think, kind of after the fact, trying to make sense of all this, I realized two things. The first is that in wishing me suffering, she was really wishing me love. And I think one of the the confusing things in the book is I didn't really know how to, you notice I often say love and then in brackets hyphen suffering.
Yeah.
And that's my kind of attempt to convey that you can't really quite separate the two things. So often when people were talking to me about love, they assumed it involved suffering in some way or another. But I think what this instance with Kadra demonstrated is that she was wishing me a really particular kind of love, a kind of heart-bursting, transformative kind of love that, despite the pain it might cause, was ultimately kind of redemptive and fundamental to the experience of being human. So I think that's part of it. But I think she was also wishing me to share in something, and to know love suffering in a way that she had known it, and in sharing it to kind of feel less alone. And so I was kind of unsettled by this realization, because I'm like, what kind of ethnographer am I if there is this disconnect, if we fundamentally understand the experience of love and suffering in the same way, and if we don't, what does that mean? And I think I ultimately came to the point that I think that love songs in a kind of, in some way, also embody this desire that we are separate human beings, but we want to know something about what the other might be feeling. And love songs kind of come from a space of wanting to share something of yourself and wanting to know something of what another is feeling. And it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to completely understand each other. But I think they're ultimately about a desire to share in something, and to be understood on the basis of shared vulnerability. So that's kind of what I attempt to grapple with that encounter in the conclusion, in a somewhat open-ended way.
Kind of speaking about the new age music, or the current music making. So Khadra was somebody that already, she had risen to fame in a Somali context before the state collapse. She was a infamous singer, but at the time when you met her in Hargeisa, she had come back from the diaspora. She was not singing anymore. And, I think there's also something about a certain age standard too, that, they're not held to certain standards, like men and women, they're kind of seen as like an elder figure of sorts, like somebody you can go to for advice, things like that. So she had already kind of reached, she was already at this like maximum status, like in terms of this socio-cultural context in Hargeisa at the time. And then you also wrote a chapter about Abdel Nasser Ma'al Aidid, who was still performing regularly at Hiddur. And so he was also involved in a band, which his daughter was a part of too, right?
Fansan. Dexon sang with him.
And a bunch of youngsters. So what were, like, before we kind of go into Abdel Nasser, but could you briefly kind of touch on kind of like the differences, like that of the two spaces, like kind of what came with it, like what similarities also came with it
of the two? So the space, so it's really interesting thinking back also for me, because they died 6 months apart also. And it's really, really close to each other, and I've spent a lot of time in the wake trying to make sense of a lot of different things, because they both passed away before the book came out, and just as it was kind of going through the final stages of production. And I think one of the things that I realized in retrospect was really how different their experiences as artists had been, despite the fact that they were born 3 years apart. They were almost the same age. And they were both musicians. I think one of it is partly generation. So even though they were almost the same age, Qadr kind of came of age as a singer, as you said, in the 70s, when she was really quite young, was really established and well known at the time of the war, and I guess privileged enough that before everything completely imploded, she ended up in the UK and kind of claimed asylum. and then lived in the UK for a long time and was able to make the choice then to move back to Hargeisa. Abdi Nasser, he was born in Aden, kind of like similar. There's a lot of parallels to Abdullah Karshi's story. Came to Hargeisa as a young man in the 80s. Had just kind of started his career with Danan Hargeisa, and then the war started. I remember him telling me like they performed at the Tima Ade. They used to always play at Tima Ade, like the week before Hargeisa was destroyed.
Wow.
And so then he kind of fled without his instruments, left everything behind, told me these really kind of poignant stories of when they were passing through a village, when they were en route to a refugee camp in Ethiopia, and he saw somebody scooping water from what he thought was a calabash. And then he got closer and he recognized it as an oud. And yeah, which is, it's just, yeah, it's, yeah, really kind of striking story of the fate of instruments and musicians, and then ended up in a refugee camp where he did continue to make music and was reunited actually with one of his another oud of his that somebody else had managed to bring, and then made music as I said before with kind of Cook the Halgan, played on the front lines, and then it was when Belegu Bedle was captured. He told me he kind of put down his oud and picked up a gun, and then was a kind of active combatant, and returned to Hargeisa. He started playing music again in 1994, and was really one of the only musicians through the kind of 90s and the 2000s in Hargeisa attempting to make music, and so he was kind of a link between Khadra's generation and the younger generation of artists, but he didn't have the fame that Khadra did. The other major difference is that he's a musician and not a singer, and I think musicians have always been they've always occupied a slightly different space than singers, and I think, yeah, I'm just trying to. So when I knew Khadra, she was kind of already retired, had her own house. People came and visited her all the time. I wouldn't say like she wasn't made wealthy by her singing career, but I think because people knew her, they took care of her. Abdi Nasser, he played music until he no longer physically could play music, and he needed to make money to survive, which was certainly not easy to make a livelihood in Hargeisa as a musician, even up to today. Though I think YouTube, monetized YouTube accounts have probably shifted things in a different way. But to be a musician in that setting was really not easy. And he moved. The time I knew him, he lived in 4 or 5 different houses. He was moving for various reasons. People knew who he was. I think he was kind of revered and celebrated in a certain way, also as a veteran in this similar ways to Sarah Halgan. But Sarah Halgan, like Khadra, had also kind of lived in the diaspora and had certain other privileges that Abdi Nasser didn't. So yeah, I think they lived, even though they were both musicians who were born 3 years apart. They existed very differently in Hargeisa in the time that I knew them, for those, both of those reasons: the time that they came of age, and also because one was a musician and one was a singer. Yeah.
I think that's wild that he came to Hargeisa in the 80s.
Yeah.
Because it was right like the beginning of the end in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I think if he had come before, then he probably could have been a part of like the state troupe
Yeah.
and like, you know,
Yeah.
like and stuff
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also when you mentioned that he was performing in Hargeisa in 94, there were still like local wars, you know, like the peace bill. Yeah,
Yeah.
this region wasn't settled at all.
Yeah.
So was he making music and like was he
Oh, I
making money
don't.
for it? Or when he
Yeah,
was
so I
performing?
don't know if he was in 94. Remember, that is when he said like he didn't. He could. He told me he couldn't make music. There was a period when kind of the war. He didn't want to make music, or he couldn't. He kind of had traded in his oud for a gun. It was in 90. He told me in 94 is when he decided he kind of picked up his oud and started playing again. I do think the way that they earned. I don't know if it was in the mid 90s. I'm not sure. I think by the early 2000s. The way they were making money is there would often be like NGOs that wanted musicians to perform at something or to write songs kind of promoting a certain health issue or political issue or things like that. So I think they were getting like little commissions to do really limited events like that, but there wasn't a regular performance space until 2014 when Hida Daur opened. He was also, like a lot of artists, they were on like the payroll of the Ministry of Information and Culture.
Yeah, I think so. That's
Yeah, but I think the money that they earned from that was pretty small, and then they would just kind of perform periodically at events that the government asked them to do, or sometimes different radio things, possibly also.
So in the time that you were around Abdi Nasser and his band and all these young artists, what was that like?
Yeah, so it was also very kind of memorable, formative part of my field work. In some ways similar to Khadra's in the fact, so his house was a kind of meeting place where people would come and just talk, have a nap, and then practice. So unlike Khadra's, this was like his house was as like a kind of active rehearsal space for musicians. They were a lot younger, so he was kind of mentoring essentially this young group who were called Fansan, and most of them were, well, including Deksan, his daughter. His son also helped out. So it was mostly like they were mostly in their early 20s, and I think, how can I describe it? What it was like? I think I was this kind of peculiar presence, because there weren't that many people learning the oud, and also because I was a woman learning the oud and I was a foreigner, so that that obviously I stood out for those reasons. I think in that space, so I really got to understand the kind of I don't know if camaraderie is the right word, but I think that for musicians, because they occupy, especially after the war, this kind of complicated marginal space, and often they live quite precariously. Part of the way they survive is there's kind of a certain set of obligations and social sensibilities between them, that they kind of take care of each other, and help each other with different things. So I was there to take oud lessons, but at various points, I don't know, dropped kids off at the madrasa or drove other members to the power station to get their lights turned back on because they'd been turned off, and also because I had a car, driving people around kind of after performances, and things like that. I remember being this might sound like a weird comment to say, but I remember being really excited the first time somebody asked me for money because it felt like I had almost become I'd become ingrained enough in the group that was kind of something that people felt comfortable and would might expect me to be able to do. Yeah, so I think in that space, I really got a sense of how kind of precariously people live, but also how they take care of each other, and and learn also to be musicians. So I was the primary thing that took me there was to learn the oud, and yeah. So I think in that space, I learned a lot about the social lives of musicians, but also the work that goes into learning an instrument and performing, and how musicians kind of develop their voice, whether it's a kind of instrumental voice playing the oud, but also how singers learn different songs, and how they interact, and how songs kind of are put together and come about. So yeah, it was a really fascinating space.
I think it's really fascinating that you also had a lot of access in terms of like the Somali music scene in very different ways, like even the interviews, like the people that you mentioned that you interviewed were all of like the greats for all intents and purposes, the legends of that space. And then being able to have such a close relationship to Khadra Dahir also gave you a whole nother avenue, because as far as like the female artists of the heyday are that kind of carried them through even to now, like Hibanura right now went back home. She was in Hargeisa, then she went to Getaway. I think she's in Mogadishu right now. To see kind of like the trajectory of like those who even people like Amina Abdullahi, who stopped singing, but Amina actually came to. The thing is, like, because London Somali Week Festival, like, when you work with Cade, so like that's kind of like the last footing where like a place to still recognize them. So even Amina Abdullahi came to London, I think, in the early 2010s, like maybe 2013, 11.
Oh wow!
And and then she was singing, but then during the later part of her life, her last few years, she was not a singer anymore. And you had opportunity to meet her. So you also have seen people at like different points, like how like that experience still kind of marks them, and what privileges does it afford them, or what kind of realities are they kind of like dealt with. But then when you're doing your time with Abdinas and Ma'alan Aidid, you kind of see what the later part of a artistic production, like post state collapse, there aren't those strong infrastructures in place. And then also with his work with Funson and these younger artists that are coming up, that are all very young in a lot, like in a lot of ways, and how the music scene, like the Somali, like some way Somalis relate to art, as we've like to music, as we've also, as the society's also become more religious. And now that you are also the artistic director at Cade, like based in London, and so like you just came off the heels of London Somali Week and this like 10-day festival, a huge production to support Somali arts and cultural production. Kind of, what are the realities for Somali artists in this day and age? What are ways in which people can support them? Like what are kind of your reflections on that experience?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Dun, dun, dun.
I think it's been interesting. It's been interesting working with Cade, because when I was doing my field work, I helped artists apply for visas to come to Somali Week. So I was on that side of it. Yeah, I saw it from that end, like these artists kind of preparing, being really excited, watching the kind of ridiculous hoops they have to go to get visas, which I think, as you know, was another drama this year. And then seeing them this year in London, I think I've not completely processed it. I think the one thing that's really exciting, because in Hargeisa, there like the opportunities to perform are really limited, and then to see the kind of young artists on stage with 800 people in the crowd, it was quite overwhelming, and to see they kind of they have this kind of support, and people love them. Even though there's like art, especially artists who are living in Hargeisa, working in Hargeisa, and have these huge diaspora followings. I think one thing I often really really couldn't completely figure out during my fieldwork, and even now, is how people are supporting themselves. I think the one really powerful thing about Somali Week is that it's not only, it brings together diaspora Somalis, not just from the UK diaspora, but from other places, with people who are living in the Horn in a way that can't really happen otherwise. And so there's a kind of exchange there, and a momentum. It leads to things that, well, maybe like the establishment of, it's hard to kind of track all the ways that these events kind of have impact beyond the initial kind of actual moment. But yeah, I think it was really exciting to be part of it.
I just wanted to end off with actually a quote, but in your book there was a part when you were talking about where you wrote, lesson number 1 of what it means to become a musician, a lesson I was reminded of every time I put my kaban in the car instead of on my back. Pursuing one's artistic passions comes at a price. Making art means accepting a life on the edges, a life of social trade-offs. Only those who sing because they need to sing, who, like Ilmi Boderi, are compelled by a kind of inescapable longing to outwardly express their inner sentiments, are likely to persevere. I think that that passage in itself is a really like great way to describe a lot of what you've laid out in the book and kind of illustrated about the lives of Somali artists, and how much really they kind of, although they have a huge space in society in some ways, but how much
it takes perseverance.
It still like shapes their lives. Like, you know, unlike here, unfortunately, they're not like financially compensated in the same way. So economically, socially, even in a lot of ways. You know. But
yeah, I think when Abdi Nasser, I think I asked him about the future of music in Somaliland, and he said, as long as I'm Abdi Nasser, I will play this oud. And that stuck with me. And I think he is not playing his own oud anymore, but yeah, he's done so much work that his oud playing will certainly live on, not only in recordings of his music, but in the way he's inspired and shaped another generation of artists. Yes.
Yeah. I
think we'll also keep playing ouds and not just synthesizers. One hopes.
No, I think you gave us a lot to think about. And if you haven't had a chance to read the book, Love Songs in Motion, there also is a website, which is a really cool project. I have to say, I like. It also kind of makes it very accessible. With that. Yeah. Lovesongs.ChristinaWoolner.com, that kind of brings the book to life, and then there's videos. The songs are translated. Like, this is an amazing piece of work. This is like, I really enjoyed reading the book and kind of going through the website. And also there's a lot of intentionality that really kind of shines through. So thank you for doing all that extra legwork. All right,
I'm just going to say, I think for me, as a kind of author, you never know what's going to happen when you kind of send something out into the world, and like a song, it will kind of gather its own momentum, possibly in different ways. But the kind of reception I've had from Somali audiences has been really humbling and encouraging. So I'm grateful for all the kind of listeners and for you and for others who've taken the time to read the book and to reflect on it, and yes, I'm very happy to hear from anybody who wants to talk about it.
Ku kala naqrono meel wana